Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to The Global Current. I'm Priya Bave.
And I'm Ian Fichet.
Today in news, Afghanistan's parliament building suffers a bombing attack.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi introducing India's first international stock exchange.
And NATO continues to shuffle troops in Europe.
In analysis, controversial conservative Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte presses for greater access to birth control.
And Russia's military withdrawal from Syria.
Then, The Global Current's Zanele Najapa brings us an interview with Father Lawrence Frizzle on interreligious dialogue.
And now, Yilin Du reports on a bombing attack which struck Afghanistan's parliament.
According to the New York Times, a bombing of the Afghan parliament office in Kabul killed at least 36 people and injured at least 80 more on Tuesday, January 10th. The Taliban have claimed responsibility for the bombing. Shur Mohammed, a Kabul resident, said in an interview with the New York Times, "I was in the mosque for prayer when I heard a huge bang. It scared me and the children who were studying in the mosque." According to CNN, another explosion also took place on Tuesday in Kandahar, killing at least 11 people and injuring at least 14 more. Tolo News reported that 4 policemen were injured and 4 were killed during the bombing. According to the BBC, the suicide bomber who carried out the explosion strikes first outside the entrance of the parliament and followed up by a car bomb. A Taliban spokesperson said to a reporter, "We planned this attack for quite some time, and the plan was to target some senior officers of the intelligence agency." The United Nations condemns the attack and acknowledges the Taliban's responsibility for the lives lost. According to CNN, Secretary General's Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan, Pernille Cardell, said, "Such unprincipled, unlawful, and deplorable attacks cause immense human suffering and make the peace that Afghans need and deserve even more difficult." This is Liam Scollins reading for Yilin Du for The Global Current.
Up next, Santiago Losada brings us a report on the opening of India's International Stock Exchange.
On the 9th of January 2017, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi introduced India's first international exchange, known as India INX, at the International Financial Services Centre, IFSC, in Gandhinagar. Although the stock was inaugurated on the 9th, the trading operations are not set to begin until January 22nd. The India International Exchange, INX, will be a fully owned subsidiary of the Bombay Stock Exchange. Initially, the exchange would start trading in equity, currency, and commodity derivatives, including index and stocks. According to India Times, Prime Minister Modi believes that the new exchange will create new standards in quality of service and speed of transactions in different time zones. The new exchange was inaugurated by Mr. Modi on the eve of the 8th Vibrant Juharat Summit. The new INX exchange will trade for 22 hours a day, and it will allow foreign investors and non-resident Indians to trade on the products listed on the exchange.
It's simple but powerful. It aims to provide onshore talent with an offshore technological and regulatory framework. This is to enable Indian firms to compete on an equal footing with offshore financial centers.
INX will start its trading as soon as the Tokyo market opens, and it will end with the closing of the U.S. Stock Exchange. Bloomberg Quint says that INX will use the index derivative Sensex 50 as its first product. At the beginning, the trading currency will be the dollar, but hopefully more Indian products will be bought in moving forward. In order to help finance the new exchange, India is using $48 billion in offshore banking activities from Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong. In an interview, Bombay Stock Exchange Chief Executive Officer Ashish Kumar Chauhan said that the exchange will soon add gold, silver, copper, oil, and the rupee. Mr. Chauhan has high hopes for the exchange, and he believes that it will reclaim some lost market share in Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong. The Economic Times reports that Mr. Modi envisaged the exchange to offer products that will satisfy hedging and investment demand in an economy that is growing 7% annually. The exchange has so far created 5,000 jobs, but it still has a long way to go to meeting its targets of 500,000 jobs. Many, including the Prime Minister, sees the new exchange as a momentous occasion for the Indian financial sector, says the New Indian Express. Eventually, one of the goals is for the exchange to become a price setter for some of the largest traded goods in the world. The new exchange will also serve as a way for India to compete with other stock markets and to attract investment. For the Global Current, this is Santiago Losada.
And now, Joseph Arico reports on NATO troop movements in Europe.
To begin the new year of 2017, not only has America provided roughly 80 battle tanks and over 150 armored vehicles to support NATO in recent months, but now America will be providing ground troops to Poland in order to reassure NATO's fears of aggressive Russian movement. However, as the BBC reports, Russian President Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that these troop movements are threatening Russia's security and interests. Russia claims that these movements have been incredibly aggressive, and he also claims that Poland is not even a European nation. On the contrary, however, Poland's representative, Tomasz Sikautsky, has expressed his concern with recent Russian military exercising, continuing to quote that the illegal annexation of Crimea and the actions in Ukraine have been even more reason to call for the support that has been made. In order to continue to assure the European states, however, American NATO troops will also begin military exercises in the Baltic to counter Russia's military show of force. Poland has pushed for a permanent station of NATO troops. However, NATO officials have claimed that this is only a temporary station for troops and is only in response to the Russian actions. However, with the upcoming change in power in the United States, it is unclear as to whether the new president will continue to push such a show of force in Europe or not. According to a report made by The Guardian, these troop movements were scheduled for later in the month of January. However, current President Barack Obama has pushed this prior to his leaving. It's also worth noting that the United Kingdom has vowed to supply 3,000 troops to NATO to counter Russia as well. These forces will not only mount up on the border of Poland, but will fan out into neighboring European states in order to build a further sense of security. Finally, noting the statement that the Polish foreign minister has made, he has speculated that it is possible that the United States President-elect Donald Trump may possibly strike up a deal with Vladimir Putin. The Polish foreign minister hopes that this deal will bring an end to Russian aggressions, but also hopes that it does not come at the cost of Poland. This is Joseph Arico reporting for The Global Current.
Next up, a report from Eric Christatelia on Russia's military drawdown in Syria.
Without Russia, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would not be in the position he is now. He was losing significantly when Russia, a longtime ally, dispatched its air forces in 2015 and changed the tide of the war. A ferocious Russian air campaign around the city of Aleppo cleared the way for pro-government forces to surround opposition-held districts of the city and eventually take them over. It sparked at least 2 mass displacements, one north of the city and one in Aleppo itself, as well as the deaths of countless civilians and fighters. Russian President Vladimir Putin is maneuvering beyond his role as Assad's ally to play the part of peacemaker. Putin announced a ceasefire in late December after a fragile truce was forged by the opposition groups and the Syrian government in conjunction with Turkey. Moscow, along with Ankara and Tehran, are now brokering peace talks between the government and opposition in Astana, Kazakhstan, with negotiations set to begin January 23rd. However, it remains to be seen if main opposition forces will keep their word and peace will be acquired in the war-torn nation of Syria.
The first ones to leave the conflict zone will be ships of the carrier group of the Northern Fleet headed by aircraft carrier Admiral of the Soviet Union Kuznetsov. I would like to note that naval personnel deployment in the operation against terrorist groups allowed to liberate Syria's economic capital, Aleppo, from rebels in the shortest possible time.
Now, Russia has deemed it time to reduce the number of their forces in Syria. The decision to remove military assets from the Syrian civil war came from the head of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, who on January 6 said, "In accordance with the decision of the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, the Russian Defense Ministry is beginning to reduce its armed forces deployment in Syria." The Russian naval fleet led by Admiral Kuznetsov were the first to initiate the withdrawal by exiting the eastern Mediterranean. The Russian fleet had been operating off the Syrian coast and had provided large-scale air support to Syrian forces. On Russian state news, Syrian Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Ali Abdul Aoub stressed the importance of Russian military support given to Syria in the war on terrorism and the need to develop military cooperation with Russia even after the victory over terrorism.
Thanks to the participation of the Russian military grouping, the Syrian armed forces and patriotic forces in Syria have been able to achieve a fundamental turnaround in the fight against international terrorism, and to take the initiative on almost all fronts to create conditions, as I said already, for the start of a peace process.
However, Russia has so far failed to fulfill past promises to remove their forces from Syria. Russian officials previously announced a reduction of its military deployment in the country in March of last year, but continued supply runs by land and air before sending significant reinforcements in October. As Russia is one of the guarantors of the ceasefire, its military presence in Syria is likely to be strong for the visible future. The continued Russian control of a naval base in Tartus and a military airfield in Haifa, which many of the airstrikes have been launched further, solidates this assumption. What does the possible reduction of Russian forces in Syria mean for the Syrian government and their forces? Mazi Khaidra of the Syrian Democratic Front said, "I am looking at the step by Russia with carefulness, as there are many military groups fighting in Syria. Maybe this is the step to boost negotiation process and push aside to the negotiation table. But are the military groups ready to lay down weapons? Are they ready for the political solution? What if military groups use this time to gain more forces? We have to be careful about that." The Syrian Democratic Front is responsible for uniting the internal opposition groups of Syria, and therefore treats the reduction of Russian forces with caution, as it may give internal groups the opportunity to gain strength and take up arms against the bloody civil war to continue. Kreidy stated, "We trust Russia in what it does. We trust Russia's approach to the negotiation process. The big mission in Syria is to stop terrorism and to be against terrorism." The greater challenge that Syrian forces will face is to retake Idlib, a province almost entirely in opposition control. It is bordered on one side by Turkey, which has behaved as a back gate for the rebels, allowing troops and weapons to cross its border. The government's bid for Idlib will depend on Turkey's cooperation, but could also hinge on Russian air power. Russia was a deciding factor to the government's campaign of the neighboring countryside north of Aleppo in early 2016, and could prove to have similar effects on the campaign for Idlib. Time will tell what the reduction of Russian forces in Syria will mean for a war-torn country and its suffering citizens living in a war zone. This is Morgan Mount reading for Eric Chrysoteli.
Next this morning, Maddie Ruth analyzes Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's decision to advocate for increased birth control in the Philippines.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte signed an executive order on January 9th instructing government agencies to increase access to contraception for poor households in the Philippines. According to NPR, the executive order is called Attaining and Sustaining Zero Unmet Need for Modern Family Planning Services through the Strict Implementation of the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act. Duterte stated that by 2018, all poor households in the Philippines should have zero unmet need for modern family planning. It was only 4 years ago that universal access to birth control was granted in the Philippines. However, it is still priced too high for poor women to have access to it. Duterte said that allowing better access to birth control is important for reducing poverty, as more than half of pregnancies in the Philippines are unintentional. He addressed the issue of reproductive health in his first State of the Nation. According to BBC, this executive order puts Duterte directly in opposition to the strong Catholic leadership as well as the Supreme Court in his country. The Church has long opposed the increased laws guaranteeing contraception and has supported the Supreme Court's decision to limit the types of contraception the government is allowed to distribute. According to a local newspaper, the Philstar Global, the National Economic and Development Authority, NEDA, Director General Ernesto Pernia said that the measures in the executive order can reduce the country's poverty rate by 21% to 13 to 14%. Pernia also stated that these measures would help curb infant mortality in teenage pregnancies, which are both widespread issues in the country. Pernia criticized the Supreme Court's limitation on government distribution of contraceptives and argued that it adversely affects 7.3 million Filipino women, most of whom belong to the lowest wealth quintile, with high unmet need for family planning. According to Pew Research, the Philippines has around 76 million Catholics, which is the world's third largest Catholic population. Polls suggest that Filipinos are generally anti-abortion and abortion is illegal in the Philippines. However, most support access to contraception, sexual health education, and reproductive health care. Pernia explained that many citizens feel that the government's contraception plan is anti-life. However, according to the government, the plan is pro-life, pro-women, pro-children, and pro-economic development. Pope Francis speaks of the Philippines' great love of God on his visit to the Philippines in January of 2015.
Filipinos everywhere know that for their love of God, their fervent piety, and their warm devotion to Our Lady and her Rosary. This great heritage contains a power for missionary potential.
While this one action taken by President Duterte can be labeled pro-women, the remainder of his previous orders and statements show no respect for women. His presidency has been riddled with offensive and misogynistic comments that have been criticized by many ambassadors as well as international organizations. According to CNN, while discussing the gang rape and murder of an Australian missionary in 1989, he made the comment that as mayor, he should have been first. Even in the face of criticism, he did not retract his remarks or even explain that he was joking until years later. In 2016, Duterte likewise stated that he did not believe his daughter's claim that she was a survivor of rape. Instead, he called her a drama queen. Female Filipino Senator Riza Huertos argues on behalf of women against the misogynistic culture of the Philippines in a 2016 congressional hearing.
The battle is bigger than Senator Laila. It is about respect and decency between institutions. It is about chipping away at the structural misogyny that pervades our culture. Most of all, it is about raising little girls who believe that they can define themselves with no fear of shame, and who believe that their bodies and their lives are theirs and theirs alone. This is not just about Senator Laila. This is about every woman.
While Duterte has claimed to be making this decision because he is pro-women, it is hard to forget his long history of misogynistic comments. This is Maddie Ruth for the Global Current.
Finally this morning, Zanele Njapa brings us an interview with Seton Hall's Father Lawrence Frizzell on the subject of interfaith dialogue.
Good morning, Global Current listeners. This is our first interview of the spring 2017 semester, and it promises to be a very good one. I'm Zanele Njapa, and today I'm joined by a servant leader who inspires me immensely, and I'm absolutely honored to interview him today. We'll be taking a look at his essay that was featured in the Seton Hall Journal of Diplomacy and International Relations, titled Interreligious Dialogue in Global Perspective. Reverend Father Lawrence Frizzell was one of the key designers of the Jewish Christian Studies graduate program at Seton Hall University, a first of its kind, and is now the director and associate professor. Father Frizzell is also the consultor of the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jewish in the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. As if this wasn't enough, Father Frizzell is also the moderator of the Kinship of Catholics and Jews, an insightful radio program of Seton Hall University's WSOU, and is available for download on iTunes. Father Frizzell, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Global Current. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. We would notice in terms of the commission to which, with which I'm associated, the Holy See, that is the Vatican in Rome, has a special relationship with other religions in two areas. There is an effort to develop Christian unity, and that's called the Pontifical Commission for Promoting Christian Unity. And that goes back to the Second Vatican Council, which was from 1962 to 1965. And the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jewish People is associated with the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity because before the Council and during the Council, there was an effort to prepare a document on the Church's relation with the Jewish people. And Monsignor John Oesterreicher, my predecessor here at Seton Hall, was very much involved in drafting the text that would be presented to the bishops at the council. Now, the decision was made that religious relations with the Jewish people would be under the Pontifical Commission for Christian Unity because of the unique relationship that the Church has with the Jewish people. And then the political issues concerning the modern state of Israel are dealt with by the State Department of the Holy See. And so we do not deal with current issues which would have a political dimension, but rather the spiritual issues and the development of a deeper understanding of how the Jewish people and the Catholic Church are to grow in appreciation for each other rather than seeing tensions and difficulties that were so tragically present in the past. We want to say that all religions can make a great contribution to a search for justice and peace in our world. And so when people want to work together, we're not trying to bring everybody into a kind of an umbrella organization or with religious principles, but we're trying to say that each one adhering to his or her own faith commitment can make a contribution which is stronger when we get together with others. So this would be the context in which we try to work. And we do this on the national level. The Catholic bishops of the United States have special office for ecumenical relations and for interfaith relations. And we also have discussions on a number of points where we meet at least 4 times a year with members of the Jewish community in regard to Catholic-Jewish relations in the United States. So you have drawn attention to an essay that I wrote some time ago, Interreligious Dialogue in a Global Perspective, because the work of the School of Diplomacy and International Relations, which began here, I think it's 17 years ago now, has, of course, widened our perspectives in terms of how the Seton Hall University academic programs can relate to the, let's say, the urgent need we have in our world to develop what we can call interreligious dialogue.
Well, thank you so much, Father Frizzell, for really setting the context, because I think that lays the background for your paper, which was absolutely lovely to read. I think for me, the first line really captivated and got my attention, because you mentioned the tensions between religious and political systems and how the two constantly, since the beginning of time almost, have been back and forth against each other. And I wanted to know that this relationship has been in conflict for as long as we can remember. In your own opinion, would you say that there's hope for these two systems to work collaboratively?
Well, there's one approach where the religious community and the state are identified. And we see this in our modern world in certain countries, where the one religion so dominates that there's no room for any other religion. Now, in situations where there is a democracy, then the church and the state, the religious groups, and the country in which they live are separate, but we don't want to think that there is a question of two separate spheres, so that the religious dimension has to be a private, personal experience for each individual, but no impact on that person's social existence. Or, in other words, we want to have a voice, that the religions of the world should have a voice in discussing things which have a moral, spiritual impact, but also are a part of the domain where the political authorities will want to direct and guide the community. And so here is a dynamic then that we try to develop in such a way that there will be a positive contribution made by the religious communities to the larger, let's say, dialogue that's going on, and we want our voice to be heard, as well as people thinking, well, the voice of the secular world is to dominate. Now, there's no such thing as a neutral component in a society. That is, some people think, well, the secular, the non-religious dimension is free of prejudice. No, everybody has certain goals, and our goals have to be challenged in a friendly way by people who will point out limitations to the vision that each group might have. So each can make a positive contribution, and if there's a proper listening attitude, then we hope that the entire society will benefit by what we call a dialogue among religious communities, and then extending from the religious order to the wider political social order.
Yes, yeah, and we're gonna get to that, and I'd like to hear a bit more about that dialogue among civilizations. But for now, I just wanted to know, you also make reference to the philosophy of dialogue that you say was developed by Ebner. Can you just give our listeners just a short background on what this entails?
In the 1920s, both Ferdinand Ebner from Austria and then Martin Buber picked up the theme of I and thou. And that means that so many situations in any society, people try to manipulate other human beings, and it becomes an I-it situation. One person or one community, one group wants to dominate and control the others. Ebner and Buber emphasized that we should see each other as partners. I, thou is the traditional way of translating the German. And so the person should be, as a dialogue partner, should be seen as an equal. His or her presentations, ideas deserve to be listened to. And then together, we hope that people will be able to develop insights that will allow them to collaborate, to have an impact on the larger world, as it were. But the philosophy of dialogue then, beginning in the 1920s in Germany and Austria, was picked up and developed, especially after the Second World War, so that we try to have that sense of respect for the individual and for the minority groups in a society, so that their voice won't be stifled, and that their contribution will not be a question of somebody manipulating them, but of giving them a chance to see what they can do with relation to their own personal rights and also to the common good. So there has to be a dialogue and an interplay between what we would say the rights of the individual, and rights always must be related to responsibilities.
Of course, yeah.
So duties and rights have to go together. In many cultures, there's a great emphasis on my rights, but let's stop and think, what are my duties to the rest of society? And that's where the dynamic of growth into a collaborative effort to make our world a better place, building on the questions of justice so that we can achieve a true and profound peace among the components of a given society.
Yes, that reminds me so much of the philosophy we have in South Africa of Ubuntu, whereas I am because you are.
Okay,
and yes, and seeing others and other groups as able to contribute just as much as your group or yourself as an individual. And now, speaking about groups, as policy people, we study a lot, and in some of the readings that we read, we take a look at Samuel Huntington, who speaks about The Clash of Civilization, which is a very popular paper that speaks about how conflict in the current situation and in the world to come is going to be along cultural lines, where this could be either spread into religion, into your language, into the part of the world that you come from. And within your paper, you speak about, and it's actually one of the main plots of the paper is the dialogue among civilizations, and how the civilizations need to start speaking to each other and communicating. So I wanted to know how you define civilization. So how would you define a civilization to inform the way that we should read the paper?
Sure. Well, the word civilization and the word culture have a certain interplay. I think civilization refers to an enormous society, let's say, whereas there can be cultures within a given civilization where people have their own language, their own set of customs and principles. And we always want to bring in the moral dimension of each culture or each civilization in the sense that every group is going to be working according to certain fundamental principles. And in politics, of course, sometimes the impression is given that I am the center, and my particular tribe or my particular group is destined to dominate. And of course, that has led to many disasters in our past history. So rather than look so much at clashes between civilizations and cultures, it would be very good to step back a little bit and say, well, what can we do to overcome the clashes so that the larger society, the entire world, could be the beneficiary of people striving to indeed preserve their own self-identity. Nobody is being asked to lose his or her culture and faith experience, but to live it out in such a way that one isn't trying to crush someone else, to use that person's shoulders or head, as it were, as a stepping stone to greater domination. And so that's how I would see moving from the sense that, yes, clashes have taken place and unfortunately continue to dominate in certain parts of the world, but let's move from this idea of overcoming the other to a listening attitude where we can all share and learn from each other.
Yes. In your conclusion, you advise that lasting results require collaborative efforts and should involve experienced leaders. This is impeccable and very noteworthy advice. Would you say it can be applied in various fields, especially that of politics and policy, going back to what we were just speaking about now?
Well, yes, leadership is tremendously important, and the leader usually is a dynamic person who attracts attention for certain reasons. But we'd like to think that the people who have a democratic approach to their society will choose leaders not only because of the particular charism, the particular enthusiasm the person brings to a question, but let's look more deeply at the moral content and the way in which the person is advising that there would be a collaborative approach to solving the particular problems of a given society. Now, the society can be seen as in a number of concentric circles. We start with our own little group, but then we have to be thinking of how this interaction will be taking place with other minor groups within the society, other minorities, but especially then reaching out to see how those in the majority can, on the one hand, be respectful of the smaller groups, but at the same time also emphasize that the common good for progress of a given society, it requires that everybody understands and works together. This will involve certain compromises, but a compromise should never be on a basic principle that makes me who I am. Compromises can be in little things, but if we have a perspective on the meaning of life, which is essential to our vision, then we should not lose that, nor should we expect other people to give in, as it were, with regard to something central to their understanding.
Okay, Father Lawrence Frazelle, it was an absolute pleasure sharing this platform with you today, discussing your essay, Interreligious Dialogue in Global Perspective. Thank you so much for joining us. Once again, don't forget to listen to The Kingship of Catholics and Jews, which covers a range of interesting topics within the scope of affinity. I'm Zanele Njapa. Thank you so much for listening today, and God bless you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Priya Bhave.
And I'm Ian Fichet.
Same time.
Same place. Next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Liam Scollins. Our associate producer is Morgan Mount. Our news editor is John Trudeau. Our analysis editor is Marissa Hutton. Our technical producer is Trevor West. And then our interview segment is produced by Zanele Njapa. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on WSOU 89.5 FM, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.